At a fundraiser where America's conservative elite gathered to forge a path to victory, former Vice President Mike Pence delivers a public condemnation of current Vice President J.D. Vance. An attack so sudden and so vicious it brings the entire room to a dead stop. But as the tension becomes unbearable, J.D. Vance answers with a single devastating question, a whisper that shatters Pence's composure and leaves the powerful audience breathless. What he said would not just win the night. It would draw a battle line through the soul of the Republican Party. The Grand Washington Ballroom was a cathedral of wealth and influence that evening, its gilded architecture reflecting the amber glow of 1,000 candles, arranged in perfect symmetry along each of the 30 circular tables. The chandeliers above, massive structures of Bohemian crystal imported decades ago, caught the light and scattered it across the room in dancing fragments that gave the entire space an almost ethereal quality. The scent in the air was a carefully curated blend of white orchids, tuberose, and the faint musk of expensive cologne worn by men who measured their net worth in units most people couldn't comprehend. Women in gowns that cost more than a year's salary for the average American family moved through the crowd with practiced grace, their jewelry catching the light in sharp, brilliant flashes. This was not merely a fundraiser. It was a ritual, a gathering of the tribe, a reassertion of power in uncertain times. President Donald Trump had just concluded his address. The applause that followed him off the stage was not the polite clapping of a dinner crowd acknowledging a speaker. It was a thunderous, visceral roar, a wall of sound that seemed to physically push against the walls of the ballroom. Men in tuxedos stood with their hands raised high, clapping until their palms burned. Women clutched their pearl necklaces and smiled with tears in their eyes. For them, Trump was not just a politician. He was a totem, a symbol of defiance against a world they believed had been stolen from them by coastal elites, by a media machine that despised them, by a political establishment that had grown fat and comfortable while their towns withered and died. As the applause began to fade, the crowd settled back into their seats, a collective exhale of satisfaction. The next speaker was to be Vice President J.D. Vance, the man Trump had chosen as his successor, the new face of a movement that had begun as a rebellion and had now solidified into an army. Vance was standing just off to the side of the stage, adjusting his tie, preparing to walk into the spotlight. His face was calm, composed, the face of a man who had learned to mask his emotions in the brutal crucible of public life. He was young, only in his early 40s, but his eyes held a weight that suggested he had lived several lifetimes. He was a child of Appalachia, a son of the Rust Belt, a man who had clawed his way out of poverty through the Marine Corps and Yale Law School, carrying the scars of both experiences like badges of honor. But before he could take his first step toward the podium, before he could even raise his hand in acknowledgement of the applause that was beginning to build for him, a voice cut through the air. It was not amplified at first, but it carried with it a sharp, cold precision that made heads turn. It was a voice that commanded attention not through volume, but through the sheer force of its conviction. "Before we listen to the echo," the voice said, "perhaps we should hear from the source." The room went silent, not the gradual fading of conversation, but an immediate total cessation of sound. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses of wine hovered in midair. Even the waitstaff, trained to move invisibly through the crowd, stopped in their tracks. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward the source of the voice. Mike Pence. He was standing at a table near the front, his posture rigid, his face set in an expression of grim determination. He was a man in his mid-60s, his hair a perfect silver white, his suit immaculate, his bearing that of a man who had spent his entire life in public service and had never once allowed himself to appear anything less than perfectly composed. He looked like a man from another era, a relic of a Republican Party that valued decorum, politeness, and the careful navigation of political propriety. He looked like everything Donald Trump was not, and he was walking toward the stage. There was no invitation. There had been no announcement. He simply rose from his seat and began to move, his steps measured, his gaze fixed on the podium. It was the walk of a man on a mission, a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred. The crowd, still frozen in shock, watched him approach. Some leaned forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open, Others exchanged quick, confused glances. A few of the Secret Service agents positioned around the perimeter of the room tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their earpieces, their eyes darting between Pence and their superiors, silently asking for guidance that did not come. J.D. Vance stopped. He was perhaps 10 feet from the podium, his hand still raised in a gesture of greeting that now seemed absurd, frozen in time. He did not turn around. He did not move. He simply stood there, his body a statue, his face betraying nothing. But those who knew him, those who had worked with him, could see the subtle shift in his posture. His shoulders squared slightly. His jaw tightened. He was preparing himself, not for a speech, but for a confrontation. The cameras that had been panning lazily across the crowd, capturing the polished faces and expensive jewelry, now swiveled in unison, drawn to the drama like sharks to blood in the water. Every lens in the room locked onto Mike Pence as he reached the secondary microphone, a smaller setup positioned off to the side for introductions and announcements. He gripped it with both hands, his knuckles white, and leaned in close. His face filled the screens of the live broadcast, his expression a carefully constructed mask of righteous authority. "We all know J.D. is a good soldier," Pence began, his voice now booming through the speakers, amplified to fill every corner of the vast space. There was a warmth in his tone, a paternal condescension that was somehow more insulting than any outright attack. "He follows orders. He recites the words he is given. But leadership, true leadership, requires a soul of your own." A gasp swept through the ballroom. It was audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. This was not a policy disagreement. This was not a respectful debate between former colleagues. This was an assassination attempt, a public execution carried out in front of the most powerful people in the conservative movement. A woman in the third row, a prominent donor from Texas, placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. A senator from Florida, seated at a table near the back, set down his fork with a clatter that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. Pence's eyes, sharp and focused, locked onto J.D. Vance's back. The younger man had still not turned around, had not even flinched. He stood there motionless, his hand still raised in that frozen gesture of greeting. "You have conviction, J.D.," Pence continued, his voice dripping with false praise. "But it's borrowed conviction. You stand on a stage you did not build, speaking a truth you did not earn. You are an echo, a reflection. A puppet dancing on strings held by a man who does not care about you, only about what you can do for him." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that pressed down on the crowd, making it hard to breathe. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to have ceased. Outside, the traffic noise of Washington, D.C. faded to nothing. The only sound was the rapid, frantic clicking of a dozen cameras capturing this moment, preserving it for history. And then, slowly, with the deliberate grace of a predator that has just been challenged, J.D. Vance turned around. His face was calm. There was no anger in his eyes, no surprise, no hurt. His expression was that of a man who had been expecting this, who had perhaps even hoped for it. He looked at Mike Pence with a gaze that was steady, unflinching, almost gentle. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. This was not going to be a debate. This was going to be a reckoning. Vance took one step forward, then another. His movements were unhurried, almost serene. He walked past the point where he had been standing, past the edge of the stage until he reached the main podium. He placed his hands on either side of it, his fingers spreading across the dark wood. He adjusted the microphone with a small, precise movement, lowering it slightly to accommodate his height. And then he leaned in, close enough that his lips almost brushed the foam cover. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was not a shout or a roar. It was a whisper, a quiet, chilling inquiry that somehow carried across the entire hushed ballroom with the force of a thunderclap. "Mike," he said, the name hanging in the air alone for a moment, a single syllable that felt like an accusation. "If my voice is an echo of a great man, what is yours? The silence of a man who ran, or the whisper of the enemies you now serve?" Room erupted in gasps, but this time it was different. This was not shock. This was recognition. This was the sound of 100 people simultaneously understanding something they had felt but never been able to articulate. A donor in the back row, a weathered man in his 70s who had made his fortune in oil, dropped his water glass. It hit the table with a sharp crack, spilling water across the white tablecloth, but he didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the stage, his mouth hanging open. Mike Pence's face, which had been a carefully constructed mask of righteous authority, began to crumble. The confident smirk that had played at the corners of his mouth evaporated, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes, which had been narrowed with predatory focus, widened almost imperceptibly. His mouth opened as if to form a response, but no sound came out. He had walked onto that stage expecting a fight, but he had prepared for a brawler, for someone who would meet his attack with volume and rage. He had not prepared for a surgeon. To understand the devastating precision of that question, to grasp why it landed with such terrible force, you must first understand the man who asked it. J.D. Vance was not a product of the world represented by the grand Washington ballroom. He was not born into wealth or privilege. He did not grow up attending fundraisers or learning the unspoken rules of high society. He was born in Middletown, Ohio, a town that had once been prosperous, a hub of steel production and American industry. But by the time Vance was a child, Middletown was dying. The factories that had employed generations of men were closing, their rusted hulks standing as tombstones to a way of life that had been gutted by globalization and indifference. His childhood was chaos. His mother struggled with addiction, cycling through boyfriends and rehab stints, leaving young JD to navigate a world that felt perpetually unstable. He was raised, in large part, by his grandmother, a fierce, profane woman who loved him with a ferocity that bordered on violence. She was the one who instilled in him a sense of discipline, a belief that he could escape the cycle of poverty and addiction that had claimed so many in his family. She was the one who told him that the world outside Middletown didn't care about people like them. But that didn't mean he couldn't force it to. He joined the Marine Corps straight out of high school, seeking structure, purpose, a way out. The Corps gave him discipline, taught him to endure hardship, to function under pressure, to value loyalty above all else. When he left the military, he applied to Yale Law School, one of the most elite institutions in the country. He was accepted, and he entered a world that was as foreign to him as a distant planet. His classmates were the children of senators, CEOs, diplomats. They spoke a language he had to learn, a language of casual wealth and inherited privilege. They discussed policy in the abstract, as if the decisions made in Washington were intellectual exercises, not life and death matters that determined whether towns like Middletown survived or died. Vance learned to speak their language. He learned to navigate their world, but he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the faces of the men who had worked in the steel mills, who had raised families and built communities, only to be told by politicians and pundits that they were obsolete, that they needed to learn to code or move to a city. He never forgot the quiet desperation in his mother's eyes, the way addiction had hollowed her out, the way the system had failed her over and over again. When Donald Trump descended that golden escalator in 2015, J.D. Vance was skeptical. His intellectual training at Yale had taught him to distrust populism, to see it as a dangerous force that appealed to base emotions rather than reasoned argument. But then he went to a Trump rally, not as a supporter but as an observer, a writer trying to understand a phenomenon. And what he saw there changed him. He saw faces he recognized. He saw the anger and the hope of people who had been ignored for decades. He saw men and women who were not stupid or bigoted, but who were simply desperate to be heard, to have someone fight for them. And he realized that Trump, for all his flaws, was giving them a voice. Vance's journey to Trump's side was not one of opportunism, as his critics claimed. It was a homecoming. He had wandered through the halls of the elite, had learned their secrets, had seen the contempt with which they viewed the people he loved, and he had made a choice. He would not stay in their world. He would return to his own, armed with the knowledge of how to fight them on their terms. So when Mike Pence stood on that stage and called him an echo, a puppet, he wasn't just insulting J.D. Vance. He was insulting every person in Middletown, every family in the Rust Belt, every forgotten American who had finally found someone willing to speak their truth. He was dismissing their pain as a borrowed talking point, their anger as manufactured, their loyalty as blind obedience. And J.D. Vance could not let that stand. Mike Pence stood frozen at the secondary microphone, his face a landscape of conflicting emotions. A flush of crimson had begun to creep up his neck, a visible tide of embarrassment and rage rising against the pale shore of his skin. His lips, pressed into a thin white line, trembled almost imperceptibly. He opened his mouth, a reflexive action to reclaim control, to launch a counterattack, but the words caught in his throat. They lodged there, a log jam of pride and panic choking him. The air in his lungs felt thick and useless. He was drowning in plain sight, suffocated by a silence of his own making. J.D. Vance did not press his advantage. He did not smirk or lean forward with aggression. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the podium, his gaze steady and unblinking. He was a hunter who had set a perfect snare and was now content to watch his quarry exhaust itself in its struggle. The contrast between the two men was stark, almost biblical. Pence, rigid and flustered, radiating a desperate, crackling energy. Vance calm and centered, a study in quiet, immovable strength. Then Vance spoke again. His voice remained at that same low, conversational pitch, never rising, never straining. Yet it sliced through the tension like a scalpel through flesh. I stood with a president who was relentlessly attacked by the very people who now invite you to their dinner parties, Mike. Each word was a hammer blow, delivered with the soft, cushioned impact of a velvet mallet. The senators in the audience leaned forward, their faces a mixture of shock and rapt attention. Reporters who had been lazily taking notes were now typing with a feverish intensity, their fingers flying across tiny keyboards, desperate to capture every syllable before it disappeared into the ether. "You speak of a soul," Vance continued, taking a single deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them by a fraction. "But what becomes of a soul when it values the approval of its enemies more than the loyalty of its friends? You ran from the fight the moment the arrows started flying, straight into the arms of the archers." Pence finally found his voice, but it was not the commanding, resonant baritone the world knew. It was a strained, reedy thing, thin and brittle like ice over deep water. "That's a lie," he managed, the words sounding weak and defensive in the cavernous room. "No one is questioning your oath to a document," Vance countered instantly, his tone sharp but still controlled. "We are questioning your oath to the people who trusted you. You talk about leadership. Is it leadership to abandon your soldiers on the battlefield because the enemy promises you a comfortable retirement?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It was the sound of assent, of recognition. Vance had just articulated a betrayal that millions of voters felt but could never put into words so precisely. He was giving voice to their grief, their sense of abandonment. "You call me a puppet," Vance said, his eyes scanning the faces in the front row before returning to Pence. "But I have never seen a man more controlled by the strings of his own fear. You obeyed your fear of the media. You obeyed your fear of being cast out by the Washington elite. I obeyed my conscience. And my conscience tells me you never, ever stabbed the man in the back who put you on the stage in the first place." Pence's lips trembled again. He looked desperately out at the audience, searching for an ally, a friendly face, a nod of support. But he found none. He saw only cold, appraising stares. He saw donors who had written him million-dollar checks now looking at him as if he were a bad investment. He saw former colleagues, men who had served with him in Congress, now studying the crystal pattern on their water glasses with intense focus, refusing to meet his gaze. In that moment he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The applause started quietly. It wasn't the thunderous, obligatory roar of a political rally. It began with a single person, a woman in the third row, a county chairperson from Michigan. She began to clap slowly, deliberately. Then another joined her, and another. It was hesitant at first, then it grew, not into a wave but into a steady, rising tide of support for Vance. It was the sound of a silent majority finding its voice. From the wings of the stage, where he had been watching the entire exchange on a monitor, President Donald Trump allowed himself a small, grim nod of satisfaction. He didn't smile. The moment was too grave for that. But his eyes, fixed on the screen, held a look of vindicated pride. He had chosen his new vice president not for his polish but for his spine. And tonight, that spine was proving to be made of pure, unbending steel. The The war of words was no longer just words. It was a schism, a public and brutal divorce. Pence, seeing the room turn against him, tried to retreat. He took a half step back from the microphone, a gesture of surrender. He wanted to escape the spotlight, to melt back into the anonymity of the crowd. But J.D. Vance was not finished with him. He took another step forward, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in closer, to hang on his every word. "You want to talk about conviction, Mike?" Vance asked, the question a quiet, lethal challenge. "Where was your conviction when our cities were burning in the summer of 2020, when the media was spewing lies day and night, calling every patriot a racist? Where were you?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. "I'll tell you where you were. You were hiding behind focus-grouped press releases and praying for it all to go away. Real Americans were losing their businesses, losing their homes, losing their country, and you were silent." The live stream viewer count, which had been steady at around 500,000, suddenly surged past 2 million. Social media was a wildfire of commentary. The confrontation had gone from a ballroom drama to a national event in the space of 3 minutes. Hashtags were trending worldwide. Clips were being shared, dissected, analyzed. This was no longer a private moment. This was history being written in real time. Pence, his back now almost completely to the audience, turned slightly. "You don't understand the pressures of that office," he muttered, his voice raspy, defeated. "No," Vance's voice cut back, sharp as a shard of glass. "You don't understand the meaning of standing your ground." He turned his body slightly, addressing not just Pence but the entire room, the entire country watching at home. "Leadership isn't about avoiding criticism. It isn't about seeking applause from the editorial board of the New York Times. It's about choosing what is right, even when it costs you everything. It's about being willing to be hated by the right people." He glanced back at Pence, his expression not one of anger but of something closer to pity. "That's a lesson you seem to have unlearned the moment you traded your integrity for a favorable headline." Pence's face, already pale, drained of its remaining color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, the ghost of the man he used to be, the man he thought he was. His hands, which had been gripping the sides of the microphone stand, now hung limply at his sides. He looked defeated, hollowed out. And then J.D. Vance delivered the final, devastating blow. A sentence that would be quoted and replayed for years to come, that would be studied in political science classes and debated in living rooms across America. "You were Donald Trump's vice president, Mike. Now you're a footnote in a history book you allowed the Democrats to write for you." The room was not just stunned. It felt wounded, as if everyone present had just witnessed a great and terrible fall. The silence was profound, heavy with the weight of finality. And in the center of it all stood J.D. Vance, not as a victor celebrating his triumph, but as a reluctant executioner who had done what had to be done. He looked burdened, his shoulders carrying the weight of a truth that had needed to be spoken, no matter how painful. Mike Pence looked like a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that his political career had just ended. Not with a whimper but with a roar. Not in obscurity but in front of the entire world. The applause had subsided, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that felt almost tangible. The air in the ballroom was charged with the aftermath of the explosion, filled with the invisible shrapnel of broken allegiances and shattered reputations. People weren't whispering. They were thinking. They were processing. They were reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the man standing frozen by the secondary microphone. Mike Pence stood as if rooted to the spot, a statue of regret. His eyes, which had been darting around the room searching for mercy, now stared blankly at the deep red carpet beneath his feet, as if the intricate Persian pattern held some answer, some escape from the wreckage of the last 5 minutes. He had walked into this room a respected elder statesman, the would-be conscience of a movement. He was now an outcast, exposed and isolated in a room full of his former allies. J.D. Vance walked slowly past him, his footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He didn't spare Pence a glance. His focus was now on the crowd, on the cameras, on the millions of people watching beyond the ballroom walls. He reached the podium and placed his hands on either side of it, not to steady himself, but to ground himself, to connect with the gravity of the moment. "This isn't about personal animosity," Vance said, his voice steady, imbued with a solemnity that commanded attention. "This is about an infection that has been allowed to fester in the heart of our party for too long, an infection of cowardice that masquerades as civility." He looked directly into the main camera, his gaze intense, forging a direct connection with every person watching on a screen, every person in a living room or a diner or a bar who had stopped what they were doing to witness this moment. "The truth is, some men are given the honor of wearing the title of vice president, but they treat the office not as a sacred trust, but as a stepping stone, a bargaining chip to secure their own future, to keep their invitations to the right parties in Georgetown." Pence's jaw clenched. The reference was unmistakable. His eyes darted toward a small, powerful group of donors sitting at a table to his left. He saw one of them, a billionaire industrialist who had funded his gubernatorial campaigns, slowly shake his head, a look of profound disappointment on his weathered face. Another had already turned his chair slightly, physically angling himself away from Pence, a small but brutal act of public disassociation. "You betrayed more than a man," JD continued, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a prosecutor laying out his final, irrefutable argument. "You betrayed every single voter who stood in line for hours, who put a sign in their yard, who believed you when you said you would fight for them. They didn't send you to Washington to win the approval of the media. They sent you to be their voice. And when their voice needed to be its loudest, you chose to be silent." A woman in the audience, seated near the front, began to cry. Not loudly, but with the quiet, heartbreaking sobs of someone whose deepest fears had just been spoken aloud. She was a small business owner from Pennsylvania, a woman whose restaurant had been forced to close during the lockdowns. She remembered watching Mike Pence on television during that time, offering carefully worded statements that said nothing, that offered no hope, that did nothing to fight for people like her. Vance's words weren't just political rhetoric to her. They were a validation of her pain. "This party, this movement is not perfect," Vance said, turning his attention back to the people in the room, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "We are flawed. We make mistakes. But what we cannot afford, what we must not tolerate, are traitors from within. We don't need any more carefully polished men who run from the fight. We need fighters. And I, for one, will not stand by and let history be rewritten by the men who fled the battlefield." The room erupted. This time there was no hesitation. It was a spontaneous, overwhelming roar of approval. It was a catharsis. People leaped to their feet, their applause a thunderous wave of sound that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead. Mike Pence visibly shrank under the sonic assault. It was the sound of his own political obituary being written in real time. He took a shaky breath, a last desperate attempt to reclaim some sliver of dignity. His voice, when he spoke, cracked with the strain. You think you know," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Vance. "You weren't in the room. You don't know the pressure, the chaos." "I know what loyalty is," Vance interrupted, his voice cutting through the applause and silencing it instantly. The hall froze once more. Pence's hand trembled more violently now. "You're a child in this arena. JD, you rode into power on President Trump's coattails. I helped build that legacy. You're just walking in shoes you didn't earn." A thin, hard line formed on JD's lips. He paused for a beat, letting Pence's accusation hang in the air, letting its petty bitterness expose itself. Then he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet every person in the room heard it as if it had been shouted from the heavens. "The difference between you and me, Mike, is that I never once considered spitting on the man who gave me the shoes." A low groan of empathetic pain echoed across the room. It was over. Everyone knew it. Vance stepped forward again, his movements now imbued with a new, undeniable authority. He was no longer just the vice president. He was the leader of the room, the voice of a movement that had been searching for someone willing to say what needed to be said. "You act as if you carried some great burden," he said, his voice laced with cold contempt. "But when the moment of truth arrived, you handed the pen to the enemy and let them write the story. You let them call us traitors. You let them call us insurrectionists. You validated every lie they ever told about us, all for a pat on the head." A few older men in the audience, Veterans, by the look of their posture and the pins on their lapels, nodded in grim agreement. One of them, wearing a hat that said Vietnam Veteran, slowly, painfully got to his feet and began to clap, alone at first, his solitary applause a stark, powerful endorsement. Then another veteran stood, then another. And then J.D. Vance did something no one expected. He paused, turned slightly, and reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a slim manila folder, its edges worn, its contents clearly significant. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "This," he said, holding the folder up for all to see, "is a copy of a series of emails and text messages between the office of former Vice President Pence and several well-funded, Democrat-aligned political action committees." He let that sink in. The room was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system. "The dates are what's important. They begin just 2 weeks after January 6th, long before Mr. Pence told the American people he was praying for wisdom on his future. He was already negotiating the terms of his surrender, including speaking fees and commitments for a future presidential run." The room gasped as one. A journalist in the front row, a veteran of the White House press corps, literally jumped to his feet to get a better angle for a photo, his camera flashing like a strobe light. Pence's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. That's classified information," he barked, his voice raw with panic. J.D. replied, his tone as cold and calm as a frozen lake. "Not anymore. The relevant sections were declassified and cleared by the appropriate channels last night. I made sure of it." He looked at Pence, his gaze unwavering. "You see, Mike, transparency isn't betrayal. Scheming with the opposition while pretending to be a man of principle. That is." He walked to the podium and laid the folder down with a soft, final thud. "This isn't an act of revenge," Vance said, his voice now filled with a weary sadness. "It's a revelation. The people who trusted you, who prayed for you, deserve to know who you truly became the moment you thought the cameras were off." Pence's shoulders slumped in utter final defeat. He had no words. He had no defense. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of something dying in plain view. Even President Trump, still watching from the wings, turned to a nearby aide and whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and grim finality. He just ended him. The truth had landed. And in that devastating, clarifying moment, Mike Pence finally understood. He hadn't just insulted J.D. Vance. He had awakened a force he never knew existed, a force that would not be silenced, a force that would not back down. Outside the grand Washington ballroom, the world was exploding. News vans, which had been parked in neat, orderly lines along the curb, now resembled a chaotic swarm of predators that had caught the scent of blood. Reporters stood bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of camera lights, speaking in breathless, urgent tones into microphones, their words tumbling over one another in a race to define the moment. Breaking news chyrons scrolled across the bottom of every television screen in America, stark white letters on a blood-red banner. Pence career in tatters after Vance revelation. Trump VP, ACCUSCS, former VP of betrayal. The GOP civil war is here. Twitter was no longer a platform. It was a digital supernova. The hashtags Pence exposed and JD the Truth Slayer were trending worldwide within minutes. Video clips of the exchange, shot on shaky cell phones from inside the ballroom, were being uploaded, shared, and replayed millions of times. Every frame was being dissected, every micro-expression analyzed. Pence's trembling lip, Vance's unblinking stare, the folder landing on the podium. It was the kind of raw, unfiltered political drama that a nation addicted to conflict had been craving. The mainstream media, the very institutions Mike Pence had sought to appease, turned on him with the swift, merciless brutality of a wolf pack. Pundits who had hailed him as a hero of democracy just months before were now framing him as a tragic fallen figure, a man whose ambition had led him to a fatal miscalculation. They spoke of him in the past tense, as if he were already a political ghost. They didn't defend him. They analyzed his downfall with a detached, clinical interest. Their praise from the past year was revealed to be what it always was, a temporary tool, a convenient narrative now to be discarded for a new, more exciting one. They had used him to wound Trump, and now that he was no longer useful, they were content to watch Vance finish him off. But the reaction in the heartland, in the small towns and forgotten cities that Vance had channeled, was something else entirely. It was not glee. It was not a celebration of a political takedown. It was a profound, collective sigh of relief. On front porches in Ohio, in diners in Pennsylvania, in church basements in Iowa, people watched the clips on their phones and they wept. They were tears of vindication. For years, they had felt a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal, a feeling that their leaders, even the ones who spoke their language, would ultimately abandon them for the comforts and rewards of the establishment. They had watched it happen time and time again. And tonight, they had watched someone finally say no. They had watched a man who came from their world, who understood their pain, stand on the biggest stage and refuse to play the game. He hadn't just defended Donald Trump. He had defended them. He had defended their sense of honor, their belief in loyalty, their deep-seated conviction that you do not abandon your own, no matter how hot the fire gets. He had taken their quiet, private grief and turned it into a public, righteous roar. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had transformed. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, somber energy. The folder sitting on the podium was like a sacred object, a testament to a truth that had been spoken at great cost. J.D. Vance stood still, letting the reality of what he had done settle over the room. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't grin or pump his fist. He looked burdened, like a man who had been forced to reveal a terrible family secret for the good of the family itself. His expression was heavy, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful gravity. He had not enjoyed this. He had simply believed it was necessary. Pence stepped back from the microphone, his movements slow and clumsy, like a man waking from a bad dream. His face was a pale, bloodless mask. His hand, which had been trembling, now went to his suit pocket, fumbling for something that wasn't there. A phone, a handkerchief, an escape. The bright stage lights, which moments ago had been his element, now felt like interrogation lamps, hot and accusatory, exposing every flaw, every flicker of shame. A few senators seated near the front, men who had once considered Pence a friend and a mentor, now looked away. They couldn't bear to watch. They were embarrassed, not just for him, but by him. Even a prominent pastor from Indiana, a man who had been one of Pence's earliest and most vocal supporters, quietly folded his hands on the table in front of him and bowed his head, as if in prayer for a lost soul. Vance cleared his throat, the small sound amplified to a cannon shot in the silent room. "Mike," he said, and the use of his first name was now an act of almost unbearable pity. "You said I was a puppet, but puppets don't bring the truth to light. Traitors do everything they can to keep it buried." A woman in the front row, an older woman with kind eyes and a small American flag pin on her lapel, wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. She was a Gold Star mother. Her son had died in Afghanistan. She had voted for the Trump-Pence ticket twice, believing in their promise to put America first. Pence's actions after January 6th had felt like a personal betrayal to her, a dishonor to her son's sacrifice. Tonight she felt a sense of justice, a painful but necessary cleansing. Pence tried to speak one last time. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out was a broken, croaking whisper. This isn't fair." But J.D. Vance had already moved on. The public now saw Pence not as a man of principle, but as a hollowed-out politician who had been caught scheming. They saw Vance not as a Trump sycophant, but as a defender of the faith, a warrior for the forgotten. The perception had shifted irrevocably. The old guard was fallen. A new one was rising from the ashes. Just as the weight of Pence's political demise seemed to settle permanently over the room, a new energy began to stir. It started not at the front of the stage, but at the very back of the ballroom. A murmur, a ripple of movement. Heads began to turn, one by one, then entire sections, like a field of sunflowers turning toward a rising sun. The double doors at the main entrance, which had been closed, swung open with a quiet, authoritative push. And there, silhouetted for a moment against the brighter light of the grand foyer, stood a figure instantly recognizable to every single person in the room and to the millions watching around the world. President Donald J. Trump. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply stood there for a beat, letting his presence register, a living embodiment of the entire conflict that had just torn the room apart. The cameras, which had been locked in a tight, claustrophobic focus on the drama at the podium, now spun around with a mechanical whir, desperate to capture this new, monumental development. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals processing their own private shock, now became a single, unified body, its collective gaze fixed on the former and perhaps future leader of their movement. Mike Pence visibly tensed. If his posture had been one of defeat moments before, it now became one of pure, unadulterated dread. He looked like a man who, having just survived a shipwreck, now saw the dorsal fin of a great white shark cutting through the water toward him. He had been judged by the heir apparent. Now he was about to be judged by the king himself. Slowly, with the deliberate, almost regal pace he had perfected over 1,000 rallies, Donald Trump began to walk down the center aisle. The space parted for him as if by an invisible force. People who had been standing to applaud Vance now stood even straighter, a mixture of awe and reverence on their faces. He wasn't just a politician walking into a room. He was a symbol walking through his temple. His face was a mask of grim resolve, unreadable, which only amplified the tension. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was observing, assessing, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the scene with the cool, appraising gaze of a general surveying a victorious but costly battlefield. J.D. Vance, who had commanded the room with his quiet strength, now turned toward the approaching figure. He did not look relieved or triumphant. He looked like a loyal soldier standing at attention for his commanding officer. He gave a single, sharp nod of respect as Trump drew near, a gesture of deference that was also a transfer of power. And then he did something that spoke volumes about his character. He stepped aside. He physically moved away from the center of the podium, ceding the spotlight he had just so commandingly earned, making it clear that this moment was no longer about him. Trump reached the stage and stepped up, his movements fluid and confident. He walked to the podium, placed his hands on it, and looked out over the sea of faces. The silence in the room was now something entirely different. It was not the silence of shock or of a tomb. It was the silence of absolute anticipation. 1,000 hearts were beating in a single, suspended rhythm. He let the moment hang in the air for a full 10 seconds, a master of dramatic timing. Then his gaze shifted, moving from the crowd to the man standing broken and isolated a few feet away. He looked at Mike Pence. It was not a look of anger or of hatred. It was a look of cold, profound disappointment, the look of a father regarding a son who had failed him in the most fundamental way. "You know," Trump began, his voice calm, almost conversational, yet amplified to fill every corner of the vast ballroom. "I've been watching from the side, and I have to say, I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am of the man who just stood here." J.D. Vance's face remained a mask of calm resolve. There was no flicker of pride, no hint of a smile. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a duty that had been performed. Trump placed a hand on Vance's shoulder, a gesture of both endorsement and protection. "Loyalty," Trump said, his voice gaining strength, "is not blind obedience. Anyone who tells you that is trying to sell you something. Loyalty is having the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's ugly, especially when it hurts." Then Trump turned his full attention, his entire physical presence, toward Mike Pence. The weight of that gaze seemed to make Pence physically smaller. "I put my trust in you, Mike," Trump said, his voice now low and heavy with the weight of personal betrayal. "And you broke that trust, but that's not the worst part. You didn't just break my trust." He paused, letting the indictment build. "You broke the trust of every person in this room, and every person in this country who believed in you." Pence looked away, unable to meet his eyes. He stared at the floor, at the exit, at anything but the face of the man he had once served. And then Trump delivered the line that would define the night, a line that was both a brutal condemnation and a perfect, poetic summation of the entire event. He glanced at Vance, then back at Pence. "You stood up here and you called J.D. a puppet," Trump said, a slight, mirthless smile touching his lips. "But what you failed to realize, Mike, is that tonight he pulled your strings without ever laying a hand on you." The room broke. The carefully maintained dam of political decorum and stunned silence burst into 1,000 pieces. A roar went up from the crowd, a raw, visceral sound of catharsis and affirmation. It was a cheer not just for Trump or for Vance, but for the restoration of an order they believed in. Some people were shouting, others were crying openly, tears of relief and vindication streaming down their faces. The room, which had been the site of a tense and painful confrontation, now belonged completely to J.D. Vance and the man who had anointed him. The torch had not just been passed. It had been ripped from a traitor's hand by a true believer. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that seemed to wash over Mike Pence, erasing what little was left of his public stature. He stood there, blinking rapidly, as if the sheer volume of his rejection was a physical assault. The camera flashes were relentless, a barrage of white light that captured his humiliation from every conceivable angle, preserving it for eternity. He was no longer a participant in the evening's events. He was a historical artifact, a monument to a bygone era of the party, now being publicly decommissioned. J.D. Vance had moved back to the podium, standing beside President Trump, not in front of him, a subtle but powerful visual of restored order. Trump's arm was still draped across his shoulders, a silent, unyielding statement of alliance. The room was packed, yet the focus had narrowed to these two men, the air around them electric. Every major news network in the world had now cut away from their regular programming. This was no longer just a political story. It was a national spectacle. YouTube streams were buckling under the traffic, the numbers spiking into the millions as clips went viral in real time. "America," J.D. began, his voice cutting through the fading applause, regaining command of the room with a renewed, somber authority. He looked past the audience, into the unblinking eye of the center camera, speaking directly to the nation. "Our country isn't perfect. We've been bruised. We've been lied to by our media, by our institutions, and sometimes even by our own leaders." He did not look at Pence. He didn't have to. But no wound cuts deeper than betrayal from within. No pain is greater than the one inflicted by a man you once called a brother. Someone in the crowd, a man with a weathered face and calloused hands, choked back a sob. It was a raw, unguarded sound of grief that seemed to encapsulate the feelings of millions. "When a man," Vance continued, his voice low and steady, "chooses the polite applause of his enemies over the steadfast loyalty of his friends, he becomes smaller than his own shadow. He forfeits his right to lead." Pence turned his head, his eyes once again finding the exit doors at the back of the ballroom. They seemed a universe away. He was trapped in the spotlight, a prisoner of the moment he himself had created. He couldn't leave. Not yet. To flee now would be the final, ultimate admission of guilt. Vance lifted the manila folder from the podium again, holding it not as a weapon, but as a somber piece of evidence. "What is in this folder is not personal," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "It's painful, but it is necessary, because this country cannot begin to heal until we are willing to cleanse our own house of the people who helped the arsonists light the match." Tears were now falling freely throughout the room. The story was no longer just about Pence's political maneuvering. It had deepened into a parable about loyalty, betrayal, and the soul of a nation. As the weight of the moment settled, a new, unplanned interruption occurred. Near the side of the stage, a man in a wheelchair was being slowly, carefully rolled forward by a young woman, his teenage daughter. He was a veteran, his face etched with the lines of a hard life, his jaw set with a grim determination. J.D. Vance noticed him. He paused his speech, his attention immediately shifting from the cameras to the man. "Sir," Vance said, his voice softening with genuine respect, "it looks like you have something to say." He gestured for an aide to bring a microphone. The aide rushed a wireless mic to the man. He took it in a hand gnarled by age and hardship. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble weathered by time and pain. "I served this country for 30 years, he began, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Under 3 different presidents. I lost this leg in a dusty hellhole in Afghanistan." He gestured to his missing limb. "But I never, not once, lost my faith in this nation. Not until the day I watched Mike Pence certify that election and turn his back on President Trump. A fresh wave of gasps swept the room. He turned his head and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Pence. You stood on stages and you talked to us about courage. You quoted the Bible. You told us to be strong. But when the real storm came, when the media and the whole damn swamp came for us, you ran for cover. Pence could not make eye contact. He stared at his own shoes as if they were the most fascinating objects in the world. The veteran turned his gaze back to J.D. Vance. You, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Tonight, you reminded me of a word I thought our leaders had forgotten. Honor. J.D. blinked hard, his composure momentarily shaken. He had been prepared for a political fight, for attacks and counterattacks. He had not been prepared for this, for the raw, heartbreaking validation of a wounded warrior. The daughter placed a gentle hand on her father's shoulder. He took a deep, shuddering breath and whispered, "That's all I wanted to say." J.D. stepped back to the podium, his own voice quieter now, filled with a new depth of emotion. "America is not asking for perfect leaders," he said, his eyes finding the veterans. "She is begging for honest ones." Even some of Pence's oldest allies, men who had come here tonight intending to support him, were now bowing their heads in shame. What had started as a political fundraiser had become something far more profound. It was a national reckoning, a therapy session for a movement's broken heart. And at the center of it all was the raw, unvarnished truth, spoken not just by a politician, but through the tears and the testimony of the very people who had been betrayed. Mike Pence had always been a man of immense self-control. His public persona was a fortress built brick by brick over decades, with walls of discipline, faith, and carefully calculated speech. But now, under the relentless assault of Vance's truth, the weight of Trump's judgment, and the palpable grief of the people, the fortress began to crack. The mortar crumbled. The foundation gave way. "I tried," he finally muttered, the words barely audible, a desperate plea for understanding. He looked up, his eyes glassy with a film of unshed tears, searching the room for a single sympathetic gaze. "I tried to do what I thought was right. I didn't mean for." "You didn't mean for what, Mike?" J.D. Vance cut in, his tone not aggressive but firm, the voice of a surgeon refusing to let a patient look away from his own wound. "You didn't mean to trade the truth for your own political safety. You didn't mean to hurt the millions of people who put their faith in you. You didn't mean to let the media establishment, the people who despise everything we stand for, write the final chapter of our administration." Pence's voice grew shaky, rising in pitch as his composure finally shattered completely. I didn't think he could win again." The admission, torn from the deepest, most pragmatic corner of his soul, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "I didn't want to go down with the ship." Silence, a dead, profound, damning silence. In that single, panicked confession, he had validated every accusation. He had admitted that his stand on principle was, in fact, a political calculation, a bet, and he had bet against them. J.D. Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the remaining distance between them. He now stood directly in front of Pence, forcing the former vice president to look at him. He did not yell. He did not glower. He simply locked eyes with him, his gaze a mixture of profound disappointment and cold, hard finality. "And that," Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence, "is why you no longer belong here." Pence's lips trembled violently. He looked as if he might physically collapse. His eyes darted to Trump, who stood by the podium, his arms folded across his chest, his expression as hard and unforgiving as granite. There would be no rescue from that quarter. He turned his gaze toward the crowd, a last, desperate appeal to the jury, but they were no longer with him. They were a sea of cold, alienated faces. A few people in the front rows, donors who had known him for years, slowly stood up, turned their backs to the stage, and stood in silent, brutal protest. It was a gesture of excommunication, more powerful than any shout. J.D. Vance didn't celebrate the moment. He didn't smile or raise a triumphant fist. He looked down for a moment, as if gathering the strength to deliver the final, necessary eulogy. Then he leaned back into the microphone, his voice quiet, almost mournful. "Cowards," he said, the word resonating with the power of a biblical proverb, "run from the fire. Leaders walk through it for the people they serve." And in that moment, it wasn't just Mike Pence who had been exposed. It was the entire artifice of his political life. Every speech about courage, every invocation of faith, every claim to principled conservatism, it had all been reduced to a pile of ash, consumed by the fire he had refused to walk through. The man who had entered the room to reclaim his place in the party had instead been permanently cast out of it, not by a rival, but by the simple, unyielding force of the truth he had tried to hide. Outside the Capitol Grand Hall, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The news vans now lined the streets for blocks, their satellite dishes pointed to the sky like a strange, metallic forest. Reporters, their faces illuminated by the bluish glow of their cell phones, shouted updates to their producers. The initial headlines of a confrontation had now escalated to something far more definitive. Pence's political career annihilated in live meltdown. Vance emerges as undisputed heir to Trump. The Purge. New GOP draws line in the sand. Inside the hall, the main program had, for all intents and purposes, concluded. J.D. Vance was now seated in a large armchair on the stage, next to President Trump, in a hastily arranged question-and-answer session. Mike Pence had been quietly, almost invisibly, ushered to a seat in the shadows at the far edge of the front row. No longer a participant, but a spectator at his own wake. A reporter from a major conservative network, perched in the designated press box, shouted the first question. "Mr. Vice President Vance, after what we've witnessed tonight, do you believe there is still a place for Mike Pence in the Republican Party?" The room fell silent again, eager to hear the verdict. J.D. looked up, his expression thoughtful, his voice firm but measured. "I believe our party is long overdue for a season of accountability," he began, choosing his words with care. "Not the kind of accountability demanded by the left, but accountability from within. Accountability to our own principles and to our own voters." The crowd murmured its approval. He continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "We don't lose elections just because of the other side's lies or the media's bias. We lose them because of the quiet, polite betrayals that happen in our own ranks. We lose them when our leaders value a compliment from a CNN anchor more than the trust of a coal miner in West Virginia." He turned his head slightly, a brief, almost imperceptible glance in Pence's direction, before looking back at the press. "This was never about punishment. It's about purification. It's about protecting the soul of the conservative movement so that we don't wake up one day and find we've become the very people we swore to fight against." Pence sat in the shadows, a man erased. The light from the stage barely touched him. He looked down at his hands, turning them over and over as if seeing them for the first time. They were the hands that had shaken 1,000 other hands, signed bills into law, rested on the Bible as he took his oath of office. Now, they just looked like the hands of a lonely, broken old man. And J.D. Vance, his name, his presence, was now rising like a storm that no one, least of all Mike Pence, had seen coming. As the formal event concluded and the ballroom began to empty, a strange and somber quiet descended. The air, once electric with tension and then explosive with catharsis, now felt heavy, thick with the finality of what had transpired. Mike Pence rose from his seat in the shadows. He moved slowly, stiffly, like a man twice his age. No one approached him. No one offered a comforting hand on his shoulder or a quiet word of sympathy. The power brokers and donors who had clamored for his attention just a few hours earlier now averted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by a text message on their phone or an acquaintance across the room. He had become invisible, a ghost haunting the scene of his own demise. He walked through the center aisle, the same path Trump had taken in his triumphant entrance. But for Pence, it was a walk of shame, a gauntlet of averted eyes and deliberate silence. People didn't move out of his way with respect. They simply leaned back in their chairs, creating a space around him, a quarantine zone of political contagion. He reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and paused for a single, heartbreaking moment. His hand rested on the brass handle. Perhaps he was hoping someone would call out his name, stop him, say something, anything, to lessen the crushing weight of his isolation. But there was only silence. The only sound was the distant, polite applause for a final speaker on stage. And in that silence, the weight of his regret, of his catastrophic miscalculation, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had gambled everything on the belief that the party would eventually tire of the fight, that they would crave a return to the quiet, respectable politics he represented. He had bet that civility would be valued more than loyalty, and he had lost everything. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the foyer, not into the glare of cameras but into a cold, empty expanse. No microphones were thrust in his face. No reporters chased after him for a comment. The pack had moved on. He was old news. A chapter had ended brutally and publicly, and J.D. Vance's was now being written, not by politicians, but by the very people Pence had forgotten. Meanwhile, near the stage, Vance was surrounded. But it was not the usual scrum of reporters and political operatives. It was a slow, steady procession of ordinary people. They waited patiently, their faces etched with emotion, for a chance to speak to him, to touch his shoulder, to shake his hand. An old veteran in a worn leather jacket, his body stooped with age but his eyes bright and clear, stood waiting, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His lapel was a constellation of medals, silent testament to a life of service. Vietnam, Desert Storm, a Purple Heart. When J.D. finally reached him, the man didn't speak right away. He just looked into Vance's eyes, a long, searching gaze, as if trying to measure the depth of the man's soul. Then he slowly, deliberately held out a gnarled hand. "You spoke for us tonight, son," the old soldier said, his voice thick and shaking with an emotion he had likely suppressed for decades. "All of us who felt left behind. I've been waiting a long, long time to hear a man in Washington speak the truth like that again." J.D. gripped his hand firmly, his own throat tight. "It was an honor, sir. Thank you for your service." "No," the veteran replied, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes watering. "Thank you for finally serving us." He turned to walk away, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't you ever change. You hear me? This country can't afford to lose another real one." J.D. nodded, unable to speak, swallowing hard against the lump forming in his throat. He stood still for a moment, watching the old man limp slowly toward the exit. And then he saw it, all around him. People were crying, not with the loud, performative grief of a political rally, but with the quiet, profound tears of people who had been given a reason to hope again. A young mother holding a sleeping toddler on her hip caught his eye and whispered, "That's our vice president." And for the first time all night, a small, genuine smile touched J.D. Vance's lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of pride. It was a smile of immense, humbling gratitude. He didn't need the applause. He didn't need the headlines. He had their hearts. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was a far greater and far heavier prize. Backstage, in a small, quiet holding room, the weight of the evening finally descended upon him. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound emotional and physical exhaustion. He sat down heavily on a small sofa, his shoulders slumping forward, and stared at the muted gray carpet. The door opened quietly, and President Trump walked in, holding 2 bottles of water. He didn't speak, just handed one to J.D. and sat down beside him. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Trump spoke, his voice low and serious. "You didn't just defend me out there tonight, J.D., he said, staring straight ahead. "You defended something much, much bigger than me." J.D. looked over, taking a slow sip of water. "I just told the truth, Mr. President." Trump let out a short, soft chuckle, a sound devoid of its usual bombast. "Yeah, but the truth isn't cheap. It costs something. You paid the price tonight." J.D. nodded slowly. It was worth it. Trump grew quiet again, then leaned in, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "They love you now, the people. They see you as one of them. Don't ever let that change you. Don't let the power, the attention, make you forget the look on that old soldier's face." J.D. looked him directly in the eye, his own gaze clear and unwavering. "I'm not in this for power, sir. I'm in this to make sure no kid ever has to grow up in a country that makes them feel ashamed of where they come from." Trump studied his face for a long moment, then placed a heavy hand on JD's back and stood up. "That," he said with a decisive nod, "is exactly why you're going to go farther than any of them." He walked out of the room, leaving JD alone with his thoughts. The night was over, but the fight had just begun. This moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something much bigger, much harder, and much more important than he could have ever imagined. By morning, the political landscape of America had been redrawn. The folder J.D. Vance had placed on the podium was not just a prop, it was a detonator. Scanned copies of the declassified emails and texts had been leaked to every major news outlet overnight. They were damning. They showed, in cold, inarguable black and white, a Mike Pence who was not a man agonizing over constitutional duty, but a shrewd political operator, actively courting the favor and funding of the very people his base considered the enemy. There were emails with prominent Democrat strategists discussing rebranding the post-Trump GOP. There were text messages with heads of never-Trump PACs outlining potential speaking tour and media appearances designed to offer a more reasonable conservative alternative. The timeline was brutal, confirming Vance's claim that these conversations had begun just days after the chaos of January 6th, while the embers were still hot. The legal fallout was minimal. Pence had been careful not to cross any lines into outright criminality, but the political fallout was apocalyptic. The Republican National Committee, which had been cautiously keeping Pence in its orbit as a potential elder statesman, issued a terse one-sentence statement before 9:00 a.m. The RNC is focused on the future of the party. It was a political execution. Major donors who had been funding Pence's next political operation began calling his chief of staff, one by one, to inform him that their support was being indefinitely suspended. His upcoming appearance on a major Sunday morning political show was abruptly canceled, the host's assistant citing a last-minute scheduling conflict. Mike Pence had vanished. He wasn't taking calls. His staff, or what was left of it, had no idea where he was. He had slipped out of the hotel in the pre-dawn hours, a man in a rumpled suit climbing into an unmarked black car, his face hidden from the single persistent photographer who had bothered to wait for him. He was a man not just in disgrace, but in exile, an exile of his own making. In a quiet, dimly lit diner somewhere in rural Virginia, he sat alone in a corner booth, a copy of the Washington Post on the table beside him. The headline screamed, "Pence Papers Reveal Shadow Campaign." He stared into a cup of black coffee, the bitter liquid untouched. He remembered the feeling of standing on that stage, the confidence, the righteous certainty. It felt like a memory from another man's life. The worst part was not the hatred from the MAGA base. He had expected that. It was the pitying, condescending tone of the articles in the very newspapers he had sought to appease. They treated him not as a fallen hero, but as a clumsy amateur who had been outmaneuvered. He hadn't just lost his party, he had lost his dignity. And he finally understood in the quiet hum of the diner that J.D. Vance hadn't destroyed him with anger. He had done it with truth, calm, steady, unforgiving truth. Back in Washington, the opposite was happening. J.D. Vance was no longer just the vice president. He had become the de facto spiritual leader of the conservative movement. His office was inundated with calls, not just from politicians scrambling to declare their allegiance, but from grassroots organizers, from state party chairmen, from county commissioners. They all wanted one thing, for him to come and speak to their people. They didn't want a politician. They wanted the man who had spoken the truth. That morning, he was scheduled for a sit-down interview with the nation's most respected and feared political anchor, a woman named Karen Dillard, known for her sharp intellect and her refusal to suffer fools. Millions tuned in, expecting fireworks. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her tone professional but laced with an undeniable curiosity. "Last night was one of the most extraordinary moments in modern political history. What was going through your mind when a man you once served alongside, former Vice President Mike Pence, stood up and publicly called you a puppet?" J.D. leaned back in his chair, his posture calm, his demeanor anything but triumphant. "Honestly, Karen," he said, his voice quiet and clear, "my first feeling was sadness." The anchor raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Sadness? Not anger. No, sadness, he repeated. Because I saw a man who had been given one of the greatest honors in this country, the chance to serve the American people alongside a truly great president. And I saw that man reduced to a vessel of bitterness and personal pride. He chose to chase the applause of the Georgetown cocktail circuit over his allegiance to the millions of forgotten men and women who trusted him. That's a tragedy, and it's worthy of sadness. Dillard nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the answer. And the folder you produced. Critics are already calling it a calculated political assassination. The truth is never an assassination, JD replied smoothly. The truth is a disinfectant. The rot in our political system on both sides of the aisle thrives in the dark. It thrives on secret deals and whispered promises. I simply chose to turn on the lights. The American people can handle the truth. It's the politicians who hide from it that you have to worry about. The interview continued, but the narrative had been set. Online, the reaction was overwhelming. The hashtags truth is a disinfectant and #turn on the lights began to trend. People were not just cheering for a political victory. They were embracing a new philosophy of leadership, one that valued transparency over empty rhetoric.